They say the person who cares less holds all the power. In the high-stakes world of New York finance, Lincoln Bennett thought power was money, influence, and the ability to discard people like used tissues. When his wife, Emery, walked into that conference room, he expected a war. He expected screaming, tears, and a fight for every penny. Instead, she gave him a calm smile that sent a shiver down the spine of the toughest lawyer in the city. She signed the papers without reading them. 10 minutes later, Lincoln wasn't celebrating his victory. He was on his knees watching his entire empire burn, realizing too late that her smile wasn't surrender. It was the countdown to his destruction. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Hemlock & Associates building smelled of mahogany polish and expensive cologne. It was a cold, sterile smell. The scent of money changing hands. Outside, the gray Seattle sky pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, weeping a steady drizzle that blurred the city lights below. Lincoln Bennett adjusted his silk tie, catching his reflection in the darkened glass. At 38, he was the picture of modern success. A jawline sharp enough to cut glass, a bespoke suit that cost more than most people's cars, and the CEO title of Bennett Dynamics, a tech conglomerate on the verge of $1 billion merger. He turned his gaze to the woman sitting across the massive oak table, Emery Hayes, his wife of 12 years. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture perfect. She was wearing a simple navy dress he had never seen before. It wasn't designer. It was modest, almost plain. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, exposing the graceful curve of her neck. But it was her face that unnerved him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't blaring. She was looking at him with a polite, detached curiosity, as if he were a stranger she had met briefly at a cocktail party. My client has reviewed the final stipulations. Arthur Hemlock, Lincoln's shark of a lawyer, said smoothly. Hemlock was a man who enjoyed the cruelty of his job. He slid a thick document across the table. As discussed, Mr. Bennett retains the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the majority stock options, and the antique car collection. Ms. Hayes will receive the lump sum agreed upon in the pre-nuptial agreement, adjusted for inflation, and— Hemlock paused, a smirk playing on his thin lips. The lake house in Vermont. Lincoln snorted. The lake house in Vermont. Lincoln snorted. The lake house. It was a rotting cabin on a muddy patch of land Emery's father had left her. It was worthless, a liability. He had tried to get her to sell it for years. Is that all? Lincoln asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned forward, trying to invade her space. Emery, you know you can't survive on just the prenup payout. Seattle is expensive. If you beg just a little, I might toss in the condo in Bellevue. He wanted a reaction. He needed a reaction. For the last 6 months, ever since he had started seeing Sarah Jenkins, a 24-year-old marketing intern, with how matched his own Lincoln had been goading Emery. He wanted her to be the crazy ex-wife. He wanted her to be the crazy ex-wife. He wanted her to scream so he could feel justified in leaving her. Emery finally moved. She reached into her purse and pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen. She didn't use the gold-plated Mont Blanc Hemlock offered her. The lake house and the prenup amount are sufficient, Emery said. Her voice was steady, lacking any tremolo of heartbreak. I don't want the Bellevue condo, Lincoln. It has black mold behind the master shower wall. You should really get that checked before you move Sarah in. Lincoln froze. He hadn't told her about Sarah. He hadn't told anyone about Sarah. He hadn't told anyone about Sarah moving in. I don't know what you're talking about, Lincoln lied, though his ears burned. Just sign the papers, Emery. Let's get this over with. I have a board meeting at 4. Of course, she said softly. We wouldn't want you to be late. She flicked to the back page. The sound of the paper turning was the only noise in the room. Scratch, scratch. She signed her name, Emery Hayes. She dropped the Bennett immediately. She stood up, smoothing her dress. Goodbye, Lincoln. I hope the merger goes well. And then she smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who had just put down a heavy backpack after a 10-mile hike. It was serene. It was terrifying. "Wait," Lincoln said, an instinctual panic rising in his chest. "That's it? 12 years, and you just walk away? You don't have anything to say?" Emery paused at the heavy glass door. She turned back, looking him up and down, her eyes lingering on his expensive watch. "I said everything I needed to say 3 years ago, Lincoln. When you missed my mother's funeral to play golf with the senator, you just weren't listening." She walked out. The door clicked shut. "Well," Hemlock chuckled, gathering the papers, "that was easier than expected. Usually, the quiet ones are the most difficult. Congratulations, Lincoln. You're a free man." Lincoln let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He should feel relieved. He was relieved. He was relieved. He pulled out his phone to text Sarah. "Done. Champagne tonight." The message failed to send. "No service." "That's odd," Lincoln muttered, tapping the screen. "Arthur, is your Wi-Fi down?" "Shouldn't be," the lawyer replied. Suddenly, the landline on the conference table buzzed. It was a jarring, harsh sound. Hemlock picked it up. "Yes? I told you not to disturb what?" Hemlock's face went pale. He looked at Lincoln, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Lincoln, it's your chief financial officer. He says he can't get through to your cell." "Put him on speaker," Lincoln snapped, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Hemlock pressed the button. "Lincoln." "Thank God," the voice of his CFO, Gary, crackled through the speaker. He sounded hyperventilating. "Where have you been?" "The feds are here." "The feds?" Lincoln laughed nervously. "Gary, calm down. What are you talking about? Is this about the merger audit? Just show them the books." "They have the books, Lincoln. They have everything." Gary screamed. "The SEC, the FBI, they raided the headquarters 10 minutes ago. They froze the corporate accounts. They froze your personal accounts. They're saying they have proof of the Cayman embezzlement scheme. They have the ledger, Lincoln. The physical ledger." Lincoln felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him dizzy. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The ledger doesn't exist." I burned it at the..." His voice died in his throat. He hadn't burned it. He had taken it to the one place nobody ever went. The one place he thought was safe because it was filled with junk. The lake house in Vermont, the lake house he had just legally signed over to Emery Hayes 5 minutes ago. Lincoln scrambled for the door, knocking over a crystal pitcher of water. It shattered, soaking the expensive carpet. He burst into the hallway, sprinting toward the elevators. "Emery!" he screamed, ignoring the startled receptionist. "Emery!" But the elevator bay was empty. The numbers above the doors showed the car descending. Lobby, garage, she was gone, and she had the only thing that could keep him out of prison. Lincoln Bennett tore out of the office building and onto the rain-slicked pavement of Fifth Avenue. The cold rain soaked his suit instantly, plastering his hair to his skull. He looked frantic, a stark contrast to the composed tycoon who had walked in an hour ago. He fumbled for his car keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them into a puddle. As he bent to retrieve them, his phone buzzed. It wasn't a text. It was a notification from his banking app. Transaction declined. Coffee bean and tea leaf. Amount $4.50. His personal credit cards were already dead. "No, no, no," he hissed, jamming the key into the door of his Porsche. The engine roared to life, a beastly sound that usually gave him confidence. Now it just sounded like a trap closing. He needed to get to the lake house. It was a 4-hour drive to the Vermont border. Maybe 3 if he drove like a maniac. He peeled out into traffic, nearly sideswiping a taxi. As he navigated the gridlock, his mind raced back to the last few years. The Cayman scheme wasn't just embezzlement. It was a complex laundering operation he had set up for some very dangerous international clients. He had been so careful, Digital records were wiped daily. The only permanent record was a hard-bound black ledger he kept as insurance leverage in case his partners ever tried to cut him out. He had hidden it inside the wall of the basement at the Vermont cabin, behind a loose panel in the old wine cellar. Emery never went down there. She was afraid of spiders. She hated that house. Or did she? The memory of her smile in the office flashed in his mind. The lake house and the Preenov amount are sufficient. She knew. She had to know. Lincoln reached for his car phone to call Sarah. He needed an ally. He needed cash. Sarah came from money. Her father was a real estate mogul. If his accounts were frozen, she could help him run until he sorted this out. "Call Sarah Jenkins," he commanded the dashboard. The line rang. And rang. And rang. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Lincoln frowned. He tried again. Same result. He dialed the front desk of the luxury apartment complex where he was paying the rent for her, the Bellevue condo Emery had mentioned. "This is Lincoln Bennett," he barked at the concierge. "Connect me to Unit 4B. "Mr. Bennett." The concierge sounded confused. "Unit 4B is vacant." "Don't play games with me," Lincoln snapped, swerving around a slow-moving truck. "Miss Jenkins lives there. I pay the damn rent." "Sir, Miss Jenkins moved out this morning. A moving crew was there at 6 a.m. She left the keys." Lincoln slammed the brakes, the Porsche screeching to a halt in the middle of the highway. Horns blared behind him. Moved out. Sarah adored him. She worshipped the ground he walked on. She was planning their freedom party for tonight. He dialed the only other number he could think of. His private investigator. A shady ex-cop named Miller who handled his dirty work. Miller. Find Sarah. Now. "Lincoln?" Miller's voice was low, hushed. "I can't talk to you, man. They're watching everyone." "Who?" "The feds." "No. Worse." "No. Worse." Caldwell. The line went dead. Ethan Caldwell. Lincoln's arch-rival. The man Lincoln had crushed 5 years ago to acquire the robotics division that made Bennett Dynamics a powerhouse. Caldwell had vowed revenge, but he had lost everything. He was a nobody now. Unless a horrifying realization dawned on Lincoln. Sarah Jenkins. Jenkins. Ethan Caldwell's mother's maiden name was Jenkins. It was a trap. A long con. Sarah wasn't a starry-eyed intern. She was a plant. And Emery? Had Emery been working with them? No. Emery was soft. Emery was the woman who cried when they put down their golden retriever. She didn't have the stomach for corporate espionage. Lincoln threw the car back into gear. He had to get to Vermont. He had to get that ledger before the FBI tore the cabin apart. If Emery had it, he could reason with her. He could manipulate her. He always had. He would apologize, beg, promise to reconcile. She loved him. She had stayed for 12 years, hadn't she? She was weak for him. 3 hours later, Lincoln's Porsche tore up the gravel driveway of the lake house. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the overgrown lawn, but something was wrong. The dilapidated cabin he remembered wasn't there. In its place stood a stunning, renovated modern cottage. The rotting wood had been replaced with cedar and glass. The roof was new. The overgrown weeds were now manicured hydrangeas. Soft, warm light spilled from the windows. It wasn't a ruin. It was a home. Lincoln stumbled out of the car. How? He handled the finances. He would have seen the withdrawals for renovations. Unless she used her own money, the money she inherited from her grandmother that she kept in a separate trust. He had always dismissed that money as pocket change. He ran to the front door and pounded on it. "Emery, open up. I know you're in there." The door didn't open, but he heard music. Jazz. Soft and inviting. He tried the handle. Locked. He ran around to the back, toward the patio doors facing the lake. Through the glass he saw the living room. A fire was crackling in the stone hearth. There was a bottle of wine on the table of vintage Pinot Noir, his favorite. And there was Emery. She had changed out of her navy dress into comfortable cashmere loungewear. She was sitting in a leather armchair reading a book, but she wasn't alone. Sitting opposite her, holding a glass of wine, was a man. He was tall, with graying temples and a kind, rugged face. He was laughing at something Emery had said. Lincoln pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging it up. He recognized the man. It was Dr. Adrian Reed, the former head of R&D at Bennett Dynamics, the man Lincoln had fired 4 years ago, publicly humiliated, and accused of stealing trade secrets just to void his stock options. Lincoln had ruined Adrian's career to boost the quarterly profit margins. Emery looked up. She saw Lincoln's distorted, desperate face pressed against the glass. She didn't jump. She didn't look scared. She simply closed her book, set it on the table, and stood up. She walked to the glass door. She didn't unlock it. She just stood there, inches away from him, separated by double-pane safety glass. "Let me in," Lincoln screamed, his voice muffled. "The feds are coming. I need the basement. Emery, please." Emery looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound pity that hurt worse than hatred. She raised her hand and pointed toward the driveway, toward the main road. Blue and red lights were flashing in the distance. The sirens were growing louder. Lincoln turned to look, panic seizing his throat. When he turned back to the window, Emery was holding something up. It wasn't the black ledger. It was a lighter, and in her other hand, a single page torn from the ledger, the page with his signature authorizing the illegal transfers. She flicked the lighter. The flame danced. She held the corner of the paper to the flame. "No!" Lincoln screamed, pounding on the glass. "Don't! That's my leverage! If you burn it, they'll bury me!" Emery watched the paper burn. She let it drop into a metal wastebasket by her feet. Then she reached down and picked up the heavy black book itself. She looked at Lincoln, mouthed the words, "It's already over," and tossed the entire book into the roaring fireplace. Lincoln sank to his knees in the mud as the FBI SUVs screeched into the driveway, boxing in his Porsche. Agents in windbreakers swarmed out, guns drawn. Lincoln Bennett, hands in the air. He didn't move. He just watched the flames in the fireplace through the window, consuming the only thing that could have saved him, while his wife toasted glasses with the man he had destroyed. The holding cell at the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac smelled of the industrial antiseptic and unwashed bodies. It was a smell that stuck to the back of the throat, a stark reminder that Lincoln Bennett was no longer in a world where air was filtered and scented with sandalwood. Lincoln sat on the metal bench, his bespoke Italian suit wrinkled and stained with mud from the driveway of the Vermont house. His tie had been confiscated, along with his shoelaces and belt. He felt small. Hollow. He had been processing the last 12 hours on a loop in his mind. The flashing lights. The handcuffs. The way the neighbors people he had sneered at for driving Fords had stood on their porches, filming his arrest on their phones. But the image that burned brightest was Emery. Emery, standing behind the glass. The fire. The book burning. Bennett. Lawyers here. The guard, a burly man who clearly enjoyed seeing a billionaire brought low, unlocked the cell door. Lincoln was led down a sterile white hallway into a small interrogation room. Arthur Hemlock was waiting, but Hemlock didn't look like the confident shark who had orchestrated the divorce meeting that morning. He looked terrified. He was sweating, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "Get me out of here, Arthur," Lincoln demanded, though his voice cracked. "Post the bail. Use the offshore reserve if you have to. I need to get to the office and shred the digital backups." Hemlock let out a dry, humorless laugh. He didn't sit down. He remained standing, clutching his briefcase against his chest like a shield. "There is no bail, Lincoln. The judge denied it, flight risk, and there is no offshore reserve. Lincoln slammed his hands on the metal table. What do you mean? There's 40 million in the shell company in Cyprus. Frozen, Hemlock whispered. The DOJ has been building this case for 18 months, Lincoln. 18 months! They didn't just freeze your accounts. They froze mine. They froze the firm's. They have everything. Lincoln stared at him, the room spinning. 18 months? But how? I was careful. The only person who knew the full scope was me, Hemlock finished. And you and Emery, Lincoln whispered. She burned the ledger. I saw her. She destroyed the evidence, Arthur. That helps us, right? Without the physical ledger, it's just digital circumstantial evidence. Hemlock looked at Lincoln with an expression of disbelief. He slowly opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a photocopy, a high-resolution scan of a page from the Black Ledger. She didn't burn the original, Lincoln, Hemlock said, his voice trembling. She burned a copy, or maybe she burned the original after she scanned every single page and sent it to the SEC. This morning. Lincoln picked up the paper. It was his handwriting, the authorization for the bribe to the zoning commissioner in Chicago. The date stamp on the scan was from 3 days ago. She turned me in, Lincoln asked, his voice barely audible. Emery? She didn't just turn you in, Hemlock said, backing toward the door. She's the star witness. She's been cooperating with the FBI for 6 months. In exchange for immunity. Immunity for what? She didn't do anything. Immunity for what? She didn't do anything. Immunity for knowing and not reporting it sooner, Hemlock clarified. She played you, Lincoln. She waited until the divorce was signed. She waited until the assets were transferred. She secured her exit, and then she pulled the trigger. Hemlock put his hand on the doorknob. I can't represent you, Lincoln. I'm indicted as a co-conspirator. I'm here to tell you I'm cutting a deal. I'm testifying against you. You coward! Lincoln lunged, but the shackles on his ankles caught him short. He crashed onto the table. I made you. You were nothing before me, and I'm nothing now because of you, Hemlock spat. Good luck, Lincoln. Public defenders are overworked, but I'm sure you'll find one who appreciates a challenge. The door slammed shut. Lincoln was alone again. He put his head in his hands. He tried to summon the anger, the rage that had fueled his rise to the top. But all he felt was a terrifying clarity. Emery hadn't just left him. She had surgically removed him from his own life. Why? The question hammered at him. Why wait 12 years? Why now? And then a memory surfaced, a memory he had suppressed. 3 years ago. The hospital. He had been in Tokyo for a merger. Emery had called him, crying. Something about a routine checkup turning into emergency surgery. He had told her he couldn't leave. The Japanese investors were on the fence. He had sent her a massive bouquet of lilies and a diamond bracelet. When he came back a week later, she was home. She was pale, quiet. She never mentioned the surgery again. He never asked. He assumed it was woman troubles. He realized now, sitting in the cold interrogation room, that he didn't even know what operation his wife had undergone. He didn't know the name of her doctor. He knew nothing about the woman who had just destroyed him. While Lincoln was screaming at the walls of a federal cell, Emery Hayes was standing on the deck of the Vermont Lake House, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and wood smoke. Dr. Adrian Reed stepped out onto the deck, handing her a mug of tea. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside her, a silent, comforting presence. They took him away? Emery asked, not looking up. It's all over the news. Adrian confirmed softly. Arraignment is set for Tuesday. Hemlock flipped. The CFO flipped. It's a domino effect, Emery. Bennett Dynamics is effectively dead. Emery took a sip of the tea. It was Earl Grey, exactly how she liked it. Lincoln had never remembered how she took her tea. He always bought her coffee, even though she hated the taste. I don't feel happy, Emery admitted. I thought I would feel a sense of victory, but I just feel tired. You're grieving, Adrian said. Not for him, but for the time you lost. Emery nodded. She turned to look at Adrian. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his hands rough from months of woodworking. When Lincoln had fired Adrian 4 years ago, blacklisting him from the tech industry, Adrian had almost lost his house. He had spiraled into depression. Emery had found him by accident. She had been at a charity gala, one Lincoln forced her to attend, but then abandoned her to network. She had escaped to the garden for a cigarette, a habit she hid from Lincoln. Adrian was there, working as a valet parker because no lab would hire him. They had talked. At first it was just awkward pleasantries, then over months of clandestine coffee meetings, they found a shared kinship in their trauma. Lincoln Bennett had taken Adrian's career, and he had taken Emery's self-worth. Do you remember what you told me? Emery asked him that day in the coffee shop, when I told you I was afraid to leave him because I didn't know how to handle the finances. Adrian smiled, the crinkles around his eyes deepening. I told you that you were smarter than him. You just needed to see the data. You taught me how to read the ledgers, Emery said. You showed me where he was hiding the money. If it weren't for you, I would have signed a divorce settlement 2 years ago for pennies and walked away ignorant. You did the hard part, El, Adrian said. I just pointed the flashlight. You're the one who walked through the dark. It had been a long game. The calm smile Lincoln had seen in the boardroom wasn't born of indifference. It was born of absolute preparation. For 2 years, Emery had played the role of the dutiful, oblivious wife. She had hosted the dinner parties. She had smiled for the cameras. All the while, she was documenting everything, every late-night phone call Lincoln took, every weird transaction. Every time he mocked her intelligence, she added a page to her file. The turning point, the moment she decided to burn him to the ground, was the surgery. It hadn't been routine. It was an ectopic pregnancy that had ruptured. She had almost died on the table. She had lost the baby a baby Lincoln didn't even know she wanted. When she called him in Tokyo, begging him to come home because she was scared she was dying, he had complained about the bad timing. That night, lying in the hospital bed alone, staring at the sterile ceiling, Emery Hayes died. And the woman who woke up the next morning was a soldier. Did you know about Sarah? Adrian asked gently, breaking her reverie. The intern? Emery let out a short, dry laugh. I knew before Lincoln did. I saw the credit card charges for the jewelry store 6 months ago. I could have stopped it. I could have confronted him, but you let him dig the hole, Adrian surmised. I needed him distracted, Emery said. I needed him so focused on his new conquest and his big merger that he wouldn't notice I was slowly moving my personal assets into the trust. I needed him to think I was weak. Stupid, the plain wife who would just fade away. She looked at the lake. Sarah was a terrible person, by the way. I met her once. She bumped into me at the office. She didn't apologize. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me like I was furniture. Karma handles everyone eventually, Adrian said. I heard she's currently trying to flee the country, but her passport was flagged because she was technically on the payroll as a consultant for the shell company. She's 24, Emery sighed. She'll learn, or she won't. Emery turned back to the house. The renovation was beautiful. This was where she and Adrian had spent the last 6 months, whenever Lincoln was away on business. They hadn't been lovers then. Emery was too principled to cheat, even on a man like Lincoln. They had been partners, builders. They gutted the rot and built something strong. Now she was free. What happens now? Adrian asked. The trial will take months. The press will be camped out at the gate. Let them camp, Emery said, a spark returning to her eyes. I have enough food for a year. I have my books. And I have the lake. She reached out and took Adrian's hand. It was the first time she had initiated the contact. And, she added, I have a new business partner. I was thinking, Bennett Dynamics is going to be liquidated. The patents for your robotics research, the ones Lincoln stole, they'll be up for auction. Adrian's eyes widened. Emery, those will go for millions. We can't afford that. Emery smiled. It was the same calm smile she had given Lincoln, but this time it reached her eyes. You forget, she said. I just divorced one of the richest men in America, and thanks to the prenup he was so arrogant about, I have a very large lump sum hitting my account on Monday. I think it's time we bought your life's work back, don't you? 3 months later, the United States Southern District Court of New York was a chaotic sea of microphones, cameras, and shouting reporters. Lincoln Bennett stepped out of the black sedan. It wasn't a limo. It was an Uber. He had been released on a heavily restricted bail pending the trial, forced to wear an ankle monitor and surrender his passport. He looked gaunt. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was graying at the temples and thinning. The stress had aged him 10 years in 90 days. He wore a suit from a department store. Racker's assets were still frozen, and his wardrobe had been seized as proceeds of crime. Mr. Bennett, is it true you hid $40 million in the Caymans? Lincoln, do you have a comment on Sarah Jenkins' plea deal? Mr. Bennett, how do you feel about your wife buying your patents? Lincoln kept his head down, pushing through the crowd. That last question made him stumble. His wife buying his patents. It was the ultimate humiliation. Emery and Adrian Reed had formed a new company, Phoenix Robotech. They had purchased the core IP of Bennett Dynamics at the bankruptcy auction for pennies on the dollar because no one else wanted to touch the tainted assets. He entered the courtroom. The air was stifling. He took his seat at the defendant's table next to his court-appointed public defender, a young, overworked woman named Ms. Kincaid, who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. The prosecution table was full. 5 lawyers, a mountain of evidence boxes, and behind them, in the first row of the gallery, sat Emery. She looked radiant. She was wearing a cream-colored suit, her hair loose and wavy. She wasn't hiding. She sat with her head held high, looking straight ahead. Next to her sat Adrian Reed, looking clean-shaven and sharp in a suit that fit him perfectly. Lincoln felt a surge of bile. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to ask her how she could sleep at night. But before the judge could enter, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A hush fell over the room. A man walked in. He was in his 60s, using a cane with a silver wolf's head handle. He moved with a predatory grace. Ethan Caldwell. The man Lincoln had destroyed to build his empire. The man whose mother's maiden name was Jenkins. Caldwell didn't sit in the back. He walked right up to the railing behind the defense table. He leaned in, smelling of expensive cigars and vengeance. "Hello, Lincoln," Caldwell whispered. His voice was like gravel grinding together. Lincoln turned slowly. "You," he hissed. "You planted her. Sarah." Caldwell chuckled softly. "Sarah? Sarah is my grand-niece, a bright girl. A bit dramatic, but she played her part well. She kept you distracted while the walls were rotting." "You ruined me," Lincoln said, his voice shaking. "No, Lincoln," Caldwell corrected him. "I just gave you the rope. You're the one who tied the noose. You were so busy looking at the stock ticker, you didn't look at your wife. You didn't look at your staff. You treated people like variables in an equation." Caldwell gestured to Emery. "I approached her, 6 months ago. I offered to buy her out. I offered her $10 million for dirt on you." Lincoln's eyes started to Emery. Had she sold him out to Caldwell too? "And?" Lincoln asked. "She turned me down," Caldwell said, a grudging respect in his tone. "She told me she didn't want my money. She told me she didn't want revenge. She just wanted out. She gave the FBI the info for free, Lincoln. She didn't do it for profit. She did it because it was the right thing to do. Caldwell tapped his cane on the floor. That's the difference between you and her. You think everything has a price. She knew the value of integrity. Mr. Caldwell, please take a seat, the bailiff warned. Caldwell smirked. Enjoy prison, Lincoln. I hear the food is adequate. Oh, and by the way, I just bought your Hamptons estate. I'm thinking of bulldozing it. It has a terrible view. Caldwell walked away, taking a seat on the prosecution side. All rise. Judge Harrison entered the room. He was a stern man with no patience for white-collar criminals. Case number 49201, the United States versus Lincoln Bennett. The proceedings began. It was a bloodbath. The prosecution laid out the timeline. The wire transfers. The emails Lincoln thought he had deleted. But the worst part was when they called the witnesses. First, it was Gary, the CFO. He wept on the stand, detailing how Lincoln had bullied him into cooking the books. Then it was Arthur Hemlock. He was cold, clinical. He dissected Lincoln's instructions, painting Lincoln as the mastermind and himself as the reluctant follower. And finally, late in the afternoon, the prosecutor stood up. The people call Emory Hayes to the stand. Lincoln watched her rise. She walked to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the truth. She sat down and looked at the prosecutor. She didn't look at Lincoln. Not once. Ms. Hayes, the prosecutor began, can you tell the court when you first realized your husband was engaged in illegal activities? Objection, Ms. Kincaid shouted. Spousal privilege. The witness has waived spousal privilege, the prosecutor stated calmly, as part of her immunity agreement regarding the RICO Act stipulations. The judge nodded. Overruled. You may answer, Miss Hayes. Emory took a breath. Her voice was clear, amplified by the microphone. It filled the room. It was 3 years ago, she said. August 14th, the day I lost our child. The courtroom went dead silent. Lincoln felt like he had been punched in the gut. I was in the hospital, Emory continued, her voice unwavering. Lincoln was in Tokyo. I needed to find our insurance information. I went into his home office. He had left his laptop open. There was an email chain open from a bank in the Cayman Islands. The subject line was Structuring the Concealment. She paused. I read it, and then I read the next one, and the next one. I realized that the business trip he was on wasn't a merger. He was moving assets to hide them from the IRS. He was committing a felony while I was losing his baby. Lincoln stared at her. The date, August 14th. He remembered the date. He had been at a karaoke bar in Roppongi with the investors when she called. He had silenced the call. Why didn't you go to the police then? The prosecutor asked. Emory finally turned. She looked straight at Lincoln. Her eyes were sad but dry. Because I loved him, she said simply. I hoped he would change. I hoped that if I loved him enough, if I was a good enough wife, he would stop. I wanted to save him. She looked away, back to the jury. But then I realized, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can only save yourself from drowning with them. Lincoln put his head down on the table. He felt the tears coming. Not the angry tears of the morning, but hot, stinging tears of shame. He had lost her 3 years ago. He had just been too arrogant to notice she was gone. The jury deliberated for 3 days, to Lincoln Bennett, sitting in the holding cell beneath the courthouse. It felt like 3 decades. He replayed every decision he had made in the last 10 years. Every bribe. Every cut corner. Every time he had looked at Emory and seen a fixture rather than a partner. When the bailiff finally came for him, Lincoln was shaking. He walked into the courtroom, his legs feeling like lead. The room was packed. The media presence had doubled. The story of the billionaire's betrayal had captured the nation's attention. It wasn't just about money. It was about the domestic tragedy at the center of it. The quiet wife who brought down the king. "Will the defendant please rise?" Lincoln stood up, his knees knocked together. He looked over his shoulder. Emery was there, in the same spot. She was holding Adrian's hand. Her face was unreadable. She wasn't smiling anymore. She just looked resolved. "In the matter of the United States versus Lincoln Bennett, on the charge of securities fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty," the jury foreman announced. Lincoln squeezed his eyes shut. "On the charge of money laundering." "Guilty." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud." "Guilty." The word rang out 24 times. Guilty. 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 Judge Harrison waited for the murmurs in the gallery to die down before he spoke. He peered over his glasses at Lincoln. "Mr. Bennett," the judge said, his voice echoing, "you had everything. You had wealth, talent, and by all accounts a spouse who was willing to stand by you through thick and thin. But your arrogance convinced you that the laws of this country and the laws of basic decency did not apply to you. You treated people as disposable assets. You treated your wife as a liability." The judge paused, shuffling his papers. "This court is not lenient on white-collar crime when the damage is this extensive. You stole pensions. You destroyed careers. You ruined lives to pad a bank account you couldn't even spend. I sentence you to 25 years in a federal correctional institution without the possibility of parole for the first 20 years. Lincoln gasped. The air left his lungs. He would be 58 years old when he got out. His life was over. The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. "Remand the prisoner to custody immediately." Two marshals grabbed Lincoln's arms. He didn't fight them. He felt numb. As they dragged him toward the side door, he turned his head desperately toward the gallery. "Emery," he choked out. It was a pathetic, broken sound. "Emery, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the baby. I'm sorry about the baby. I'm sorry about everything." The courtroom went silent. He saw Emery stiffen. She slowly stood up. She looked at him across the sea of wooden benches. For a second, Lincoln thought he saw a flicker of the woman who used to make him pancakes on Sunday mornings. The woman who used to smooth his hair when he was stressed. But then she simply nodded. A slow, final nod of acknowledgement. She turned to Adrian. "Let's go home," she said. She turned her back on him. She walked out of the double doors, into the bright light of the corridor, and didn't look back. Lincoln was shoved through the steel door into the darkness of the prisoner transport corridor. The heavy door clicked shut, severing him from the world he had built, and the woman he had lost. 5 years later. The recreation room at the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix was a study in sensory deprivation. It smelled perpetually of industrial floor wax, stale instant coffee, and the metallic tang of damp wool. The air was thick, recycled through vents that hadn't been cleaned since the 80s, carrying the low, humming tension of 300 men who had nowhere to go and a lifetime to get there. Lincoln Bennett sat on a molded plastic chair that dug into his spine. He was 53 years old, but he looked 70. The thick, dark hair that had once been styled by the best barbers in Manhattan was now white, thinning, and shorn close to his skull in a regulation buzz cut, the sharp jawline. Once the envy of his peers, was hidden beneath loose, graying skin. He had lost 30 pounds, his bespoke suits replaced by an ill-fitting khaki jumpsuit that hung off his frame like a shroud. Here, he wasn't the CEO of Bennett Dynamics. He wasn't a visionary. He wasn't even Lincoln. He was inmate 8942. "Hey, 402, move your head." Lincoln flinched, shifting his weight. A large inmate named Miller, who had been incarcerated for racketeering, was standing behind him, pointing a thick finger at the television mounted high on the wall behind a protective plexiglass shield. "I said move," Miller grunted. "Market watch is on. I want to see if my crypto is still tanking." "Sorry," Lincoln mumbled, his voice raspy from disuse. He spent most of his days in silence. He shifted his chair to the side, his eyes drifting to the screen. It was a daily form of self-flagellation. While other inmates watched sports or sitcom reruns, Lincoln watched the financial news. He watched the world he had built and the world that had exiled him spin on without a single hiccup. He watched young, hungry sharks make the same moves he had made, waiting to see if they would be caught or crowned. The anchor on CNBC was straightening her papers, a breaking news graphic flashing red at the bottom of the screen. "We interrupt this program for a live press conference from Silicon Valley," the anchor announced, her voice cutting through the din of the rec room. "Tech giant Phoenix Robotech has just unveiled its latest breakthrough in medical technology, a device that analysts are saying will revolutionize prenatal care." Lincoln felt a cold hand grip his heart. Phoenix Robotech. The name still tasted like ash in his mouth. He leaned forward, ignoring Miller's grunt of annoyance. The screen cut to a wide shot of a stage. It was sleek, minimalist, and bathed in warm, golden light, a stark contrast to the cold, fluorescent flicker of the prison. The logo behind the podium was a stylized phoenix rising from flames, colored in a deep, elegant navy blue. Lincoln recognized that color. It was the exact shade of the dress Emery had worn the day she signed the divorce papers. The day she smiled. "This device, the Gabriel unit, is designed to perform non-invasive, life-saving surgeries on high-risk pregnancies," the reporter's voiceover explained. "It is projected to save thousands of lives annually, preventing the very tragedies that often go unspoken." The camera zoomed in, the crowd parted. And there she was, Emery. Lincoln stopped breathing. He gripped the edges of his plastic chair so hard his knuckles turned white. She looked older, yes. There were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But she didn't look tired. She looked radiant. She was wearing a crisp white lab coat over a professional charcoal suit. Her hair, once pulled back in severe, tight buns to look serious for Lincoln's corporate dinners, was now loose, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves. She stood at the podium, not with the timid posture of a trophy wife, but with the commanding presence of a titan. Next to her stood Adrian Reed, the man Lincoln had fired. The man Lincoln had destroyed. Adrian looked healthy, sharp, and confident, wearing the title of Chief Technology Officer as easily as he wore his tailored jacket. "We dedicated this technology to the future," Emery spoke into the microphone. Her voice was amplified, filling the prison rec room. It was steady, strong, to the idea that no one should have to suffer loss because of negligence, arrogance, or a lack of care. "We built this company on transparency, on integrity, and on love." Lincoln felt tears pricking his eyes. Integrity. The word felt like a slap. Then the camera angle widened, and the breath left Lincoln's lungs completely. Standing between Emery and Adrian, clutching a small stuffed bear, was a little girl. She was perhaps 4 years old, with tumbling curls and wide, curious eyes. Emery looked down at the child. The professional mask dropped, replaced by a look of such fierce, overwhelming adoration that it hurt Lincoln to witness it. Adrian placed a protective hand on the child's shoulder, and the little girl leaned into him, comfortable and safe. A family. They had built a family. The realization hit Lincoln with the force of a physical blow. That child. She would have been conceived shortly after the trial. While Lincoln was being processed into a holding cell, Emery had been starting a life. While he was learning to survive in a cage, she was learning to be a mother. A reporter in the front row shouted a question, drawing Emery's attention back to the cameras. Miss Hayes, over here!" Critics have noted that your patent portfolio includes assets acquired from the now-defunct Bennett Dynamics. Is it true that this company rose from the ashes of your ex-husband's empire? The room went silent. Even Miller, chewing on a toothpick, stopped to listen. The camera focused tight on Emery's face. For a split second, Lincoln waited for the anger. He waited for her to lash out, to mention his name, to tell the world what a monster he was. He wanted her to hate him. Because if she hated him, it meant he still existed. It meant he still mattered. Emery tilted her head slightly. She offered the camera a smile. It wasn't the terrifying, calm smile of the divorce. It was worse. It was a polite, dismissive smile reserved for strangers and boring topics. "I don't recall that name," Emery said smoothly, her voice betraying absolutely nothing. "We built this from the ground up. The past is a closed book, and frankly, I don't read it anymore. We are only interested in what comes next." "I don't recall that name." The crowd on the TV cheered. Emery picked up the little girl, kissing her cheek, and turned away from the podium. Adrian put his arm around both of them, shielding them from the flashbulbs. They looked like a fortress, a complete, impenetrable unit that had no space, no need, and no memory of Lincoln Bennett. "Turn it off," Lincoln whispered. His voice was trembling. "What?" Miller laughed, pointing at the screen. "Look at that stock ticker jump. That lady is printing money. You know her, 402. Didn't you used to be somebody?" "Turn it off," Lincoln screamed, the sound tearing from his throat, raw and broken. He scrambled backward, his chair clattering to the linoleum floor. The other inmates turned to stare, but Lincoln didn't care. He couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, vacuumed out by the image of the woman he had discarded, who had now discarded him so thoroughly she didn't even speak his name. He stumbled toward the window, pressing his forehead against the cold, wire-reinforced glass. Outside, the prison yard was a study in gray walls, gray sky, gray rain falling on concrete. She erased me, he thought, his mind spiraling. He realized then the ultimate truth of his punishment. It wasn't the 20-year sentence. It wasn't the loss of the money. It wasn't the uncomfortable bed or the terrible food. The true punishment was the indifference. Hate is a passion. Hate requires energy. If she hated him, he would still be a protagonist in her story, even if he was the villain. But to be forgotten, to be dismissed as a name she didn't recall, that was death. He was a ghost haunting a graveyard no one visited anymore. Lincoln slid down the wall, his legs giving out. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. On the screen behind him, the news cycle moved on to the weather, erasing Emery's face, but the image was burned into his retina. He sat alone on the cold floor, surrounded by 300 men, listening to the rainfall. He was the richest man in the prison, bankrupt of the only currency that mattered. Outside in the sun, the phoenix had risen, and Lincoln Bennett was just the ash left behind. And there you have it. Lincoln Bennett thought he was playing a game of chess, but he didn't realize he was playing against someone who had already flipped the board. He mistook Emery's silence for weakness and her patience for surrender. In the end, he lost not because he wasn't smart, but because he underestimated the power of a person who has nothing left to lose. It's a brutal reminder that in relationships, and in life, the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can face is a calm smile and a signature on a dotted line. What do you think? Did Lincoln deserve 20 years, or was losing his family the real punishment? And would you have had the courage to do what Emery did? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about karma, revenge, and the twists of real life, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you underestimate. I'll see you in the next story.